Hi everybody, we're going to start embroidering. The first stitch is the running stitch. This is sort of your most basic stitch that you have used probably if you've done any hand sewing before in your life, but it's just basically going under, over. And it's nice with a long needle. You can usually get away with three to five stitches at a time. So you're just with the tip of your needle picking up a little fabric and trying to make it equal, distant. So you're kind of going over as much fabric as you're going under. And it's called the running stitch probably because when you run, you're supposed to have the same length steps. So that's that. That should be pretty easy and self-explanatory. The next one that we're going to do, I kind of call the backward stitch. So you're going to start by making kind of a half running stitch, but instead of keeping going forward, you're going to go backwards in the hole that you came from and out a stitch ahead of the first one. So backwards a stitch, forward two stitches with 2 stitch lengths. So the needle's coming out a stitch length in front of the end of the last stitch. So you're going backwards 1 and forward 2, backward 1, forward 2. This is a great stitch for basically anytime you want a line that's connected, just like a really nice solid line. I tend to use the backward stitch pretty much most often, I would say. Wouldn't know it from this sample, considering it's not perfectly straight, but you get the idea. So I'm going to finish it by pulling from behind so that there's no gap in the line. So the next stitch that we're going to do is called a split stitch. It's very similar to the backward stitch. Now we're going to start with a mini stitch, so a little kind of shorter than you would normally make. Start the same way as you would the back stitch, going back in the first hole and then in front of the one that came before it. But now you're going to do what's called splitting. So you're going to put the needle in through the middle of the yarns in the first stitch. So this is going to create an even more seamless line than even the back stitch. So same idea, same principle, except instead of going through the hole that the yarn came out, you're going right in the middle of the last stitch, and you're using the point of the needle to actually separate the fibers and go straight in through the center of it. It's a little bit slower. Sometimes it's hard to find and get into the center of those stitches, but it does create even a more seamless, solid line. It's really nice for borders. It's nice for anything where it really requires like a delicate drawn line. Now, the nice thing about embroidery thread is that it's a 6-ply. So there's 6 individual strands that are spun together to create embroidery thread. They're not spun together very tightly. It's very easy to separate them. So that's why that's why the split stitch is possible. But also, if you're ever doing something that it needs to be more delicate, you can easily remove 1, 2, or 3 of those individual hairs, and you can just make the embroidery thread thinner that way. And that's a pretty common practice. Many people who embroider do not use the full 6 strands. So there you go. That is the split stitch. All right, so the next stitch that we're going to try is called the chain stitch. So this one starts a little differently where you're coming up from the back. Make sure your tail is long, doesn't come out. And then you're going back in the same exact hole that you came. And then forward with your needle. Sort of started the first one, just showing you that loop. okay? And then the needle is coming back up at sort of the top of the loop, which is the same length of a normal stitch. So it's catching the loop when it goes back up. So I'm going down in the same hole, and then I'm bringing the needle up through the loop, so it's catching every time. So it's basically creating a chain in through the same hole, and then like it's really, really easy. The hardest thing is to remember to make sure that needle is coming up through, like on top of the yarn from the stitch before, and that's going to be what creates that really nice, beautiful chain effect. This is a great decorative stitch. It's great for like making connecting lines between, you know, two things or two masses. But see, you can see that I sort of just forgot to pick up the loop that time and had to do it afterwards, which is fine. Go slow and make sure that the thread is underneath the needle when you pull it up. And that's going to be how you make sure that the chain stitch is working every time. Do a couple more so you can see how it works. Great. So there you have it, running stitch, backward stitch, split stitch, and chain stitch. All right, the last thing that we're going to cover is called a blanket stitch, and blanket stitches are really good for edging, so we're going to do this demo on the edge. The first thing is bringing the needle in through the center of the fabric. So in this case, I'm edging two pieces of fabric together, so it's kind of a good connector as well. So bringing the needle around the top of that edge and coming back up. So that first one is just a loop that comes right back up. First one's a little different. The second one, I'm doing a stitch over, so I'm starting from the left and going over to the right, and then I'm gonna pick up that loop with my needle before I pull that stitch tight. So let's do that again. The needle comes from the back to the front, one stitch over, and then the needle picks up the loop from the previous stitch and carries it over to the right. Back to front, and then the needle picks up the loop and brings it over to the right. And you're sort of think about that so that you're always bringing the point of the needle from the right to the left so that it links over and goes in the direction that you're traveling. So this is a really beautiful stitch for, like I said, any edges. You can do it in the center of the fabric. It ends up looking like many little L's. And you know, you might have a need for that type of form for a certain design, but most commonly you'll find it on the edge. It sort of mimics that idea of like serging, where you're trapping lots of loose fibers and giving a kind of finished look on the edge. So let's finish by kind of using the blanket stitch, but being a little bit wild. So I'm cutting a circle out of 2 layers of fabric, and I'm going to use the blanket stitch to go all the way around the circle. So I got my yarn, starting from the center again, so that my tail is hidden. So I'll just go behind and make sure it's actually hidden. And then from behind, back to front again, so making a full loop. And then around the back, but moving the needle over a step. And then making sure before I finish and pull it tight that I'm picking up that loop and carrying it over. So it's the same exact thing as that we did at the top of the fabric, but this time I'm just moving in a circle. So every stitch I'm going to kind of rotate the fabric around so that I'm always looking at it the right way. Catching the loop and pulling that stitch over with me, so that what this is going to do is create this really beautiful edge around the hole. So this is a great stitch for any time there is actually a hole. We're going to talk a lot about mending in that we're not necessarily trying to hide the hole or the tear or whatever has happened to damage the structural integrity of the fabric. We're just trying to potentially highlight it and give it ornamentation, and this is one way of doing that. From here, there's some nice linking stitches that you can do to actually fill in the hole, and we can cover that in the next video. But for now, just so you can see the blanket stitch in its sort of in a different form, here's the last stitch, bringing it around, and just to kind of carry out the circle, I think I'll do one more, so that the inner line of purple that's protecting that raw edge is totally covered. There we go. That's it.